was invited by a friend to attend a Restorative Justice Coalition meeting inside the federal penitentiary here on Vancouver Island. Well, I'd never been in the penitentiary, let alone have any idea of what restorative justice was about. But it had a ring to it, restorative justice. And the ring was about my original social justice mission in my life. So I was beginning to learn to trust my intuition, follow that thread. So for about 8 weeks, once a week, every week, I would go out on Thursday evenings and join a small group of volunteers. We would go inside the prison. You had to get security clearance, and it took a month or so to get that. But then I would go each week with this group of men and women, volunteers, to sit in a circle in the chapel inside the prison with a group of 10 or 12 inmates. I have learned since to call them prisoners, not because it's insulting, but because that's the way they think of themselves. The idea being to have a conversation, and they even appreciated the opportunity to speak with outsiders about what's going on out in the world. Most of these men are lifers. They've been in prison for a very long time. And in Canada, while we don't have the death penalty, if your crime is serious enough, you will probably never leave the prison system. Even on parole, you will always be in the system. There was the odd occasion when I would speak about this intensive journal process. And after about the third time they heard me mention it, 2 or 3 of the prisoners said, "Sounds kind of interesting. Is there some way we could do that in here?" I'll keep the long story short. I had to go through an approval process that included the inmate committee. The prisoners had to approve this, as well as the parole officers and the prison administration. Because the biggest challenge was, if we were going to do it inside the federal penitentiary, I had to be able to promise privacy. Now, all prisoners are guaranteed constitutionally to their privacy, but it's prison, and there's no guarantee of privacy. So if I were going to invite these men to do this writing, I had to drive that stake into the ground, and I couldn't promise it to the men. It had to come from the prison administration. Well, they granted it. I wasn't sure they were going to, but they did. So we did our first trial with about 6 men. But here was where I had to make a major shift. You had to move away from the 2-day weekend workshops. There was no way that was going to happen in a prison. They were even kind of reluctant to give me as much as 2 hours once a week. So I had to swallow hard and make a decision, because I was going to have to swim upstream to 60 years of tradition with the intensive journal process to do this. So we started, and the first group took to it like ducks to water. Even after the first session, I learned 2 things. One is it would be impossible to do any more than 2 hours at a time with men who are so emotionally deprived, traumatized, and socially isolated to deal with these pieces of their life. The other thing I learned was that they needed time between the sessions. But the moment I gave the first writing assignment, every head in the room went down to their paper, and they would not stop writing. That no one lifted their head until I said, "Okay, next prompt." And they lifted their head, and I had them. They were with me. We were as one almost immediately. I had to advise the parole officers, don't make anybody come. Don't bribe anybody to come. Well, they learned they didn't need to. The guys who have been in the process sold it. Every time we offer the program, it fills. If you think you've got difficulties in your life about trying to recover personal agency, a recover of dignity, of a sense of self-worth, you can multiply that by about 10. But as soon as you offer the opportunity with some privacy and some safety, and a structured environment where there's not a lot of blather and feedback, and we quite frankly ignore the pathology. Almost all the men come in with PSTD diagnosis. Well, we just skip over that. We're just gonna let them talk about their life. They can't stop talking about it. And even the parole officers say that. Even the correctional officers say, what are you doing in there? One of the parole officers, who actually came to one of our public workshops, she decided she needed to find out for herself how this worked. She came back to me later and said, the reason I went is because one of my parolees, as soon as he was in your course for about 3 weeks, I noticed he began taking better care of himself. He started combing his hair. He started dressing differently. He started eating better. And he became more cooperative with me and the correctional officers. So she said, I had to figure out how that happened. This is not a didactic process. We do not teach anything. We only provide the writing prompts, because everything a person who is stranded in their diminished sense of self already has everything they need to recover from it. But until they find a way through the shame and the fear and the grief, they don't have access to it. They don't recognize it. As soon as they start writing and can put it on paper, for the first time for many of them have never even had the kind of counseling or consulting that lets them surface any of that. They begin now to what we call own their life. One of the things we have learned is the powerful impact, and I say this to the guys in the prison, this journaling writing will in fact enable you to do your time more productively in a rehabilitative mode that you won't get with some of the other programs that you're doing in here. Your electrical, your woodworking, they help. But what is necessary here is for you to think about not only getting out of here, because this process will help you pass your parole board hearings. It has already helped an enormous number of guys. More importantly, it will give you a sense of the life you can have after parole, after you leave this prison. Of those 90 men who have participated in this course since 2017, about 78 of them have been released into the community, successfully passed their parole hearings. Of those 78, over a 7-year period, not one of them has come back to prison. Not one.